According to research published by the American Heart Association, nearly 8 out of 10 strokes could be prevented if people recognize the warning signs early enough to act. But there is one sign showing up almost every single night that most seniors dismiss as nothing more than being tired. It happens right before bed. It feels harmless. And doctors say it is one of the most overlooked stroke warnings there is. If you are over 60, stay with me for the next few minutes because what I am about to explain could genuinely change how you think about your nighttime routine and possibly save your life or the life of someone you love. This is not a scare tactic. It is simply information that almost nobody your age was ever actually given, explained clearly in one place. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something. What age are you watching this at tonight, and what time do you usually head to bed? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps me understand exactly who I am talking to, so I can keep bringing you the kind of information that actually matters for your stage of life, instead of generic advice that could apply to anyone. Now let's talk about the sign itself. Every night, right before sleep, many seniors experience a strange sensation and never think twice about it. Some describe it as a sudden weakness in one hand while holding a book or a phone. Others notice their face feels slightly heavy or numb on one side as they settle into their pillow. Some feel a brief wave of dizziness or notice their words come out just a little slurred when they say goodnight to a spouse. Some describe a strange, brief blurring in one eye that clears within a minute or two. And almost every single time it gets brushed off. It is blamed on exhaustion. It is blamed on getting older. It is blamed on nothing at all, simply forgotten by morning. But according to research from Johns Hopkins Medicine, these brief episodes can actually be signs of what is known as a transient ischemic attack, often referred to simply as a mini-stroke. A transient ischemic attack happens when blood flow to part of the brain is temporarily blocked, usually by a small clot or a narrowed vessel. Unlike a full stroke, the symptoms typically resolve within minutes to an hour, sometimes even less. And that is exactly why so many people miss it entirely. It disappears before they even have time to become concerned. Here is the part that should genuinely get your attention. Data from the Mayo Clinic shows that roughly 1 in 3 people who experience a transient ischemic attack will go on to have a major stroke within 1 year, and a significant portion of those major strokes happen within the very first 48 hours after the initial warning sign appears. 48 hours. That is not a distant, far-off risk sitting somewhere in the future. That is the very next day, sometimes the very next few hours. So why does this tend to happen specifically at night, right before sleep, rather than during the middle of the afternoon? This is where the biology becomes genuinely important, and I want to walk you through it simply, one idea at a time, because understanding why something happens is exactly what makes it possible to actually catch it when it counts. When you lie down at night, your blood pressure naturally begins to shift. During the day, gravity and an upright posture help blood circulate more evenly throughout your body, particularly up toward the brain. But once you lie flat and your body begins settling into sleep, blood pressure regulation changes noticeably. According to research referenced by Harvard Health Publishing, blood pressure naturally dips during the early stages of sleep, in a pattern researchers refer to as nocturnal dipping. In most healthy adults, this dip is mild, expected, and completely harmless. But in seniors who have underlying issues like atherosclerosis, meaning arteries that have narrowed over time due to plaque buildup, that same ordinary nighttime dip can be just enough to briefly starve a small area of the brain of oxygen. That is exactly what produces the numbness, the weakness, or the momentary confusion we just described. There is also a second reason this shows up more at night specifically, and it has to do with something as simple as dehydration. Throughout the day, most people are naturally drinking fluids, water with breakfast, coffee mid-morning, tea in the afternoon. But by the time evening rolls around, fluid intake tends to drop off sharply, partly because many seniors intentionally reduce liquids before bed to avoid nighttime bathroom trips. The Sleep Foundation has noted that mild nighttime dehydration can meaningfully increase blood viscosity, meaning your blood becomes thicker and moves more sluggishly through your vessels. Now combine that thicker, slower-moving blood with the natural nighttime blood pressure dip we just talked about a moment ago, and you have exactly the conditions capable of triggering a brief blockage in a narrowed vessel. Let me translate all of that into something simple and memorable. Thicker blood, moving more slowly, through vessels that may already be somewhat narrowed, arriving at the exact moment your blood pressure is naturally dropping for sleep. That precise combination is why this warning sign shows up almost exclusively in the minutes before bed, and almost never gets recognized for what it actually is. If you have ever felt a strange tingling sensation in your hand as you were drifting off, or noticed your smile looked slightly uneven in the bathroom mirror before bed, or felt a wave of dizziness while lying down that passed within just a few minutes, I want you to comment the word "notice" down below. You are far from alone in this, and understanding what this actually means tonight puts you in a much better position than the millions of people who simply shrug it off every single night. It is also worth understanding how common this actually is, because the numbers tend to surprise people. According to the CDC, someone in the United States has a stroke roughly every 40 seconds, and a transient ischemic attack, the kind we are discussing tonight, is believed to occur even more frequently, since so many cases go completely unreported. Researchers estimate that a large share of transient ischemic attacks are never mentioned to a doctor at all, precisely because the symptoms fade so quickly and feel so easy to explain away. That means the real number of these nighttime warning episodes happening across the country is almost certainly far higher than what gets officially recorded, simply because most people, understandably, don't think a 2-minute episode is worth mentioning at their next appointment. Age plays a significant role here as well. The American Stroke Association notes that stroke risk roughly doubles every 10 years after the age of 55, which means the warning signs we're discussing tonight become increasingly relevant with each passing decade. This is not meant to alarm you, it is simply meant to explain why paying closer attention to these nighttime signals becomes more valuable, not less, the longer you live, rather than something that only matters for a narrow age window. Whether you are just entering your 60s or you have been retired for 20 years, the underlying biology we've discussed tonight applies just the same, and the earlier you build the habit of noticing these signs, the more protected you become as the years continue to add up. Now here is where this becomes even more important, because there is a specific detail almost nobody ever talks about, and it happens to be the exact reason this warning sign gets confused with something completely harmless so often. Most people naturally assume that if a symptom happens while they are lying down, getting comfortable, and feeling sleepy, it must simply be related to fatigue. Restless legs, a pins and needles sensation from poor circulation in a crossed leg, or ordinary tiredness after a long day. And to be completely fair, those things are real, they are extremely common, and the overwhelming majority of the time, a strange nighttime sensation really is nothing more than that. So how do you actually tell the difference between harmless tiredness and something that matters? According to guidance from the American Stroke Association, the key distinguishing factor is that a transient ischemic attack almost always affects only one side of the body. Ordinary fatigue, poor circulation, or restless legs tend to affect both sides fairly evenly, or shift around from one moment to the next, or come with an obvious explanation like sitting in an awkward position for too long. But numbness, weakness, or drooping that shows up suddenly on just one side of the face, one arm, or one leg, especially when it is paired with any trouble speaking clearly or forming words, represents a very different pattern entirely. It is sudden. It is one-sided. And it does not come with an obvious explanation like a pinched nerve or a cramped muscle from lying in one position too long. There is a simple method that emergency physicians widely recommend for catching this in the moment, and it is genuinely worth memorizing, especially before bed, when your guard is naturally down and you are the least likely to be paying close attention. It is called the FAST method, and it stands for face, arms, speech, and time. Face, meaning does one side of the face droop noticeably when you try to smile? Arms, meaning if you raise both arms out in front of you, does one arm drift downward on its own? Speech, meaning is your speech slurred, strange sounding, or hard to understand even just slightly? And time, meaning if you notice any single one of these signs, the time you act matters more than almost anything else, because treatment received within the first few hours can dramatically change the long-term outcome. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, stroke treatment administered within the first 3 hours of symptom onset can significantly reduce the risk of long-term disability. Some newer clot-dissolving treatments have extended that window somewhat, but every physician will tell you the same thing: earlier is always better, and there is no version of this where waiting longer improves the outcome. But because these nighttime episodes are so brief, and so easy to quietly dismiss as simple fatigue, most people never even mention them to anyone the next morning, let alone seek medical attention. They wake up feeling completely fine, assume it must have been nothing at all, and move on with their day exactly as usual. And according to researchers, that specific pattern, feeling fine the next morning and moving on, is exactly the pattern that tends to precede a large percentage of major strokes down the line. I know all of this might feel a little heavy to sit with, and that is not my intention here. This is not meant to scare you or make you afraid to go to sleep at night. It is meant to hand you the exact knowledge that most people your age were simply never given clearly, so that if this ever happens to you or to someone you love, you know precisely what it might mean, and precisely what to do next without any hesitation or confusion. There is one more distinction worth knowing. because research increasingly shows that stroke warning signs do not always look identical from person to person. According to the American Heart Association, women in particular are somewhat more likely to experience less typical warning signs, including sudden fatigue, disorientation, or a general sense that something feels wrong, without the more classic one-sided weakness or drooping. This matters at night especially because a vague sense that something feels off right before bed is exactly the kind of symptom that gets quietly dismissed as simply needing rest. If something feels distinctly wrong, even without a textbook symptom attached to it, that feeling itself is worth paying attention to and worth mentioning to someone. Before we get into exactly what to do, I also want to briefly mention a few related nighttime signs that often travel alongside this one, because doctors say recognizing the fuller picture makes the primary warning sign even easier to catch. A sudden, unusually severe headache right before bed, one that feels distinctly different from an ordinary headache, is sometimes reported alongside these episodes, according to Johns Hopkins Medicine. Some people also describe a brief, unexplained wave of nausea or a sense of unsteadiness when standing up to walk to the bathroom right before sleep. None of these signs on their own automatically mean something serious is happening, and most of the time they truly are harmless. But when any of them show up together with one-sided numbness, weakness, or slurred speech, that combination is exactly what should prompt you to take the moment seriously rather than dismiss it. It's also worth briefly addressing something many people wonder about, which is whether sleep apnea plays any role here. According to research highlighted by the Sleep Foundation, untreated sleep apnea, which causes repeated brief pauses in breathing throughout the night, has been linked to an increased overall risk of stroke, partly because those breathing pauses also cause repeated dips in blood oxygen levels overnight. If you or your spouse have noticed loud snoring, gasping, or long pauses in breathing during sleep, that is worth mentioning to your doctor separately, since treating sleep apnea directly can meaningfully lower your overall risk profile over time. So let's talk through exactly what you should do if you ever notice this warning sign, step by step, so there is no confusion in the moment. First, and this is the single most important step of all, do not simply go to sleep and wait to see if it passes on its own. I know that can sound difficult, especially late at night, when the symptom has already faded and everything feels normal again. But according to Johns Hopkins Medicine, even when symptoms resolve completely within a few minutes, a transient ischemic attack should always be treated as a genuine medical emergency, because there is no reliable way to know in the moment whether it will fully resolve or progress into something far more serious. The safest choice, every single time, is to seek medical evaluation that same night, not the following morning. Second, if you live with a spouse, a family member, or anyone else nearby, tell them immediately when it happens, even if it feels embarrassing, or like you might be overreacting about nothing. Having someone close by who understands the fast warning signs and can act quickly if symptoms return or worsen is one of the simplest, most effective safety measures available to you, and it does not cost a single thing. Even if you live alone, consider sharing the fast method with a nearby family member or neighbor ahead of time, so they know exactly what to watch for if they happen to check in on you and notice something seems slightly off. Third, start keeping a simple written record, even something as basic as a small notebook on your nightstand. If you ever notice these kinds of brief symptoms more than once, even if each individual episode feels minor and passes quickly, write down the date, the approximate time, and exactly what you felt in that moment, including how long it lasted and what you were doing right before it started. According to research from the American Heart Association, a pattern of repeated transient ischemic attacks is actually one of the strongest predictors that a major stroke may be approaching, and having a clear written record makes it far easier for a physician to recognize that pattern quickly and act on it, rather than treating each individual episode as an isolated, forgettable event that gets mentioned once and never brought up again. Fourth, sit down and talk with your doctor honestly and specifically about your personal risk factors, especially if you live with high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, irregular heartbeat, or a family history of stroke, since each of these conditions changes how closely these nighttime signs should be monitored. The Mayo Clinic notes clearly that these underlying conditions are exactly what transform the ordinary nighttime blood pressure dip and blood thickening we discussed earlier from a normal, harmless part of falling asleep into something genuinely dangerous. Managing these risk factors directly and consistently is one of the most effective ways to reduce how likely you are to experience this warning sign in the first place. And finally, something remarkably simple that gets overlooked constantly, and yet may be the single easiest change on this entire list to actually make. Staying properly hydrated throughout the entire day, not just occasionally, helps meaningfully prevent the nighttime blood thickening we talked about earlier in this video. The Sleep Foundation specifically recommends spreading your fluid intake evenly throughout the day rather than avoiding it altogether and then drinking large amounts right before bed, which can also interfere with sleep quality in its own right. A body that stays properly hydrated throughout the day naturally maintains healthier, smoother blood flow at the exact moment your blood pressure begins its natural dip overnight. One last thing worth mentioning, sleep position itself can play a small supporting role here as well. Some research has suggested that consistently sleeping on one particular side, especially for people who already have some degree of narrowed circulation, may very slightly influence blood flow patterns overnight. This is a much smaller factor compared to hydration and underlying vascular health, but if you find yourself regularly experiencing this warning sign and you always sleep the same way, it is worth mentioning to your doctor as one small additional piece of the overall picture. I also want to briefly touch on something practical, which is what an actual medical evaluation looks like if you do experience this warning sign and decide to seek care that same night, since knowing what to expect tends to make people far less hesitant to act. According to Johns Hopkins Medicine, doctors will typically start with a neurological exam, checking things like grip strength, facial symmetry, and speech clarity, followed by imaging such as a CT scan or MRI to look directly at blood flow in the brain. In many cases, blood tests and a check of heart rhythm are included as well, since certain irregular heart rhythms are themselves a known contributor to clot formation. The entire process is usually far less invasive and far less frightening than people expect, and catching a transient ischemic attack early often means the difference between a straightforward course of preventive medication and a far more serious hospital stay down the road. It's also worth saying plainly, clearly, and without any exaggeration, that no single lifestyle change eliminates risk entirely, and nothing in this video is meant to replace an actual, ongoing conversation with your own physician, who knows your specific health history far better than any video ever could. What this information is meant to do is simply close the gap between a symptom happening and a symptom being recognized, since according to nearly every source we've referenced tonight, from the Mayo Clinic to Johns Hopkins to the American Heart Association, recognition and speed are consistently the two factors that matter most in determining outcomes. Beyond hydration and knowing your personal risk factors, there are a few additional daily habits worth mentioning briefly, since prevention tends to matter just as much as recognition. The American Heart Association points to regular movement throughout the day, even something as simple as a short walk after dinner, as genuinely helpful for maintaining healthy circulation and blood pressure regulation overnight. Reducing excess sodium, particularly in the evening meal, has also been shown to support more stable, predictable blood pressure while sleeping, according to guidance from the Mayo Clinic. And limiting alcohol in the hours before bed matters as well, since alcohol can noticeably affect both blood pressure and hydration levels in ways that directly compound the exact nighttime risks we've spent this entire video talking through together. None of these changes need to happen all at once, and small, consistent adjustments tend to matter far more than a single dramatic overhaul. I also want to gently address something I hear often, which is a hesitation to bring these kinds of concerns to a doctor for fear of sounding dramatic over something that resolved on its own within a few minutes. Physicians consistently say the opposite is true. According to the American Stroke Association, doctors would always rather evaluate a brief episode that turns out to be nothing, than never hear about one that turns out to matter. There is no such thing as wasting a doctor's time by mentioning a symptom like this. It is exactly the kind of information doctors want and need in order to help you stay ahead of a much bigger problem down the road. If you found this helpful tonight, and I really hope you genuinely did, do me a favor and check back in with me tomorrow morning to let me know how you slept, right here in the comments below. It means a lot to hear from you, and it helps me know this information is actually reaching the people who need it most. And if you have a parent, a spouse, or a close friend who might genuinely benefit from knowing this, please take 30 seconds right now and send this video to them tonight, before they go to bed. It genuinely might be the difference between someone recognizing this exact warning sign for what it truly is, or simply brushing it off the way almost everyone else does night after night, without ever knowing the risk sitting quietly behind it. Understanding your own body only becomes more important as the years go on, and the small pieces of information that seem minor today, like knowing the real difference between ordinary tiredness and a genuine warning sign, are exactly the kind of knowledge that ends up protecting you and the people you love most, often at the exact moment it matters. I want to leave you with one final thought before you head to bed tonight. Most of the warning signs we've talked about in this video last only a few minutes, sometimes less. It would be completely understandable to lie there, feel it pass, and simply decide it wasn't worth mentioning to anyone. That instinct is natural, and it is exactly the instinct that researchers say leads so many transient ischemic attacks to go unrecognized until it is too late to act on them proactively. Tonight, as you get ready for bed, take just a moment to notice how you actually feel. Not out of fear, but out of the same quiet awareness you'd want for anyone you care about. If something feels different, one-sided, or simply not quite right, trust that instinct enough to mention it tonight if possible, rather than waiting to see if tomorrow feels normal again. Knowledge like this doesn't need to create worry, and it shouldn't. It creates readiness, calm awareness, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from actually knowing what to look for. And readiness, according to nearly every physician and researcher we've referenced tonight, is consistently what separates a close call from a life-altering event. I will see you in the next one, and until then, take good care of yourself tonight and sleep well.